My name is Carter Winslow, a modest scholar in the clandestine arts, enlisted by the Global Intelligence Agency. I was flattered to discover that I would be helming the GIA's current daring endeavor, a project set deep beneath the Earth's surface in the experimental lab, designated LT-39, scheduled to begin in a week's time. The purpose? Nothing less than the design and implementation of a groundbreaking and chillingly effective means of inflicting pain. A deterrent, aimed to prevent any potential GIA turncoats, and a punitive measure for international contract killers who would dare set their sights on the leadership of our shadowy organization. Throughout this endeavor, I'll be meticulously documenting every detail for posterity's sake, in both the written and video formats. Once the dust has settled and the project formally concluded, I'll take it upon myself to synthesize the data, making meaningful conclusions about our experiment's effectiveness. I express my gratitude to my superiors for entrusting me with this endeavor, one that will indubitably fortify the GIA's standing for the foreseeable future. I feel compelled to counter any presumptions you may have. No, I'm not some deranged prodigy, nor am I akin to the monstrous Frankensteins depicted in popular media. Indeed, I must admit that I'm not an emotional bastion. I've been suppressing my real self since joining the ranks of the GIA. Our headquarters, situated beneath the surface of Concave, a secluded island, is the hub of a nefarious syndicate. My association with them, although rewarding, hasn't come without its fair share of distress. Not only is there the moral dilemma of aligning with the criminal world, but also the emotional cost, all too steep. Yet, the allure of financial security proved too potent to resist. 2 years into this life, I inked the unbreakable contract. Another 2 years later, I began to comprehend the frightening malleability of the human mind. We can adapt to almost any circumstance, lose our empathy, and become hardened, almost unrecognizable versions of our former selves. The human brain, after all, requires constant reminders of compassion to keep its empathetic senses alive. Unused, they atrophy, and with them, our capacity for feeling remorse for the unknown many. However, I discovered, quite belatedly, that my initial simplification of this phenomenon was woefully insufficient. My advice to any sane, rational human: never endeavor to infiltrate the minds of psychopaths. It's an exercise in madness, since discerning between the foe and the truly deranged is nigh impossible. The cryptic labyrinth of a psychopath's mind is only navigable to those unfortunate enough to have been born one. When the hour arrived to greet our unwilling participants, 13 inmates relocated from a nearby prison, my emotions were a muddled mess. Ostensibly, our initial interaction was for the purpose of taking measurements, but the niceties of introductions, albeit morbid, did serve to create a certain camaraderie before I would inevitably shepherd them to their doom in the most excruciating manners conceivable. Among them were 2 women and 11 men. As I was documenting their characteristics, one of the more formidable men lunged at me, barely restrained by the metallic confines of his cell. My heart fluttered with momentary panic, and I made a mental note to order additional restraints for this one. Deciding to engage them in conversation, I was met with a range of reactions. Some spat obscenities, while others displayed a disturbingly affable demeanor. Notably, the middle-aged murderess who suggested a foot massage after confessing to the poisoning of her husband. Their crimes, fears, and desperate cries for understanding only served to add another layer to the macabre tapestry of our predicament. Among the many, one particular inmate drew my attention. A boy, barely a teenager, the youngest specimen we'd ever had. When questioned about his impending fate, his reply, as chilling as it was revealing, "Less scared than you are," was followed by an eerie grin. A cold ripple of unease washed over me, but I swiftly dismissed it as his feeble attempt at bravado. Towards the farthest end, a young blonde woman, huddled in the corner of her cell, shed continuous tears, making claims of being falsely accused of her sister's murder. The paradox of innocence and cunning in such a setting was not lost on me. Skipping lunch for reasons evident to anyone, I steeled myself for the commencement of the experiment. Our inaugural subject was the brawny man who had attempted to attack me earlier. As he was ushered into the chamber, I could see a flicker of pure terror replace his previously defiant demeanor. Strapped to a metallic contraption reminiscent of a skeletal cage, he lay vulnerable under the shadow of a menacing array of sharp iron spikes. On receiving a tacit nod from one of the guards, I pressed the button that sent the spikes hurtling towards his exposed chest and abdomen. The pain-infused cries of the man pierced the silence of the chamber as his fists clenched and his blood began to escape from the wounds. He forced his head around, staring at me with eyes that were ablaze with terror. In an emotionless tone, I reminded him, "Remember, the more you procrastinate, the more excruciating it will be." His response, a childlike plea for me to hold his hand, was unexpected, stirring a brief sense of amusement within me. But I rejected his request in a straightforward manner, prompting him to quickly consent to the commencement of the experiment. "Don't disclose the manner of my death to my family," he implored, his voice a mere whimper before the impending ordeal. An eerie silence fell upon the chamber, disrupted only by the sounds of the scientists, who waited with their pens poised above their notepads, their eyes wide open like ravenous wolves ready to feast on their prey. A single flick of a switch initiated his excruciating ordeal. As the mechanism of torture began pulling his skin apart excruciatingly slowly, the man could only endure in silence for the first 10 seconds. But when the monitor registered his escalating pain, his silence shattered into a blood-curdling scream. Around the 3-minute mark, his organs began to surface. I had to halt the machine temporarily, fearing he was on the brink of unconsciousness. After a couple of minutes, I restarted the experiment. Exhausted and worn out, he couldn't muster the strength to scream any longer. By the end of 10 minutes, all his organs were utterly exposed. It was when they started to slide out of him that a surge of discomfort gripped me. I reminded myself that throughout this horrendous ordeal, he was still alive, still conscious. An inexplicable urge to vomit surged within me, but I repressed it, focusing on the task at hand. Despite being a convicted criminal, he was a person with a family, just like me, and my mind couldn't help but wander to the potential reactions of his family, and my own, to the horrific scene. Wrestling with this inner turmoil, I moved to a corner where neither the scientists nor the cameras could observe me. Under the pretense of studying the breathing graph in more detail, I clutched his hand, slippery from the blood that was still seeping out. The surprise in his eyes was discernible, even as his skin tore from his sides and his organs began to slosh out onto the cold, hard floor. His heavy breathing was the only sound that filled the room before it was replaced by the high-pitched beeping noise signaling his death. The following days were filled with reflections on the experiment. My boss watched the recording with a grin, making unsympathetic comments as he reveled in the brutal spectacle. I couldn't help but feel detached, observing more than participating as we readied for the next subject. A young blonde woman, incessantly pleading her innocence, was brought in. Her desperate cries went unheeded as she was strapped in for the next round of experiments. I held a syringe filled with a bluish-yellow liquid as I approached her. Her pleas for mercy only grew more desperate, but I remained unmoved, my poker face intact. The moment the needle penetrated her collarbone, her skin started turning a faint blue, and her veins bulged. Her gasps echoed through the chamber as she writhed in agony, her skin reacting to the fluid coursing through her veins. The next part of the process began as I darted towards the computer to initiate the countdown. Based on our measurements, death was expected to occur approximately 3 days from now. "Strap her head to the wall," I instructed the female scientist. As her neck turned an ashen white, indicating the onset of the reaction, she was free to go. I decided it was time to take a break. Just as I was about to exit the room, a shrill voice cut through the silence. It was her. "Carter!" she screamed. My name rang out, causing me to turn back, irritation clear in my wide-open eyes. I couldn't stand it when they called me by my name, as if trying to establish some personal connection. Her accusation caught me off guard. She saw me as a murderer. But I wasn't, was I? My job was to execute murderers, and that didn't qualify as murder. Or did it? "Who are you to judge?" she demanded. Something snapped inside me, a sudden fever enveloping my brain. My cheeks burned as if on fire, an emotional outburst I had not expected. Despite my confusion and frustration, I left the chamber to grab lunch. The day had been incredibly taxing, I changed clothes and navigated the maze of security checks to exit the underground facility. As I did, doubts crept into my mind. Was I certain of her guilt? Was my faith in the justice system strong enough to justify her impending death? The thoughts gnawed at me as I went about the rest of the day, filling out reports and performing mundane tasks. Suddenly, an alarm echoed throughout the facility, interrupting my thought process. Secret agents scattered in all directions, a majority gravitating towards the left corridor. Deciding to follow them, I ran into Lyndon, my superior, who directed me towards the cells. Two of the cells, which previously held a middle-aged woman and a bald man, were vacant. As it turned out, the two had committed suicide, their bodies found with severe head trauma inflicted by repeatedly slamming their heads against the wall. The next day, I found myself back in the chamber with the woman still strapped to the wall, her body almost lifeless. Sweat dripped down her white face, now tinged with blue. As she neared death, I offered her some water and compared her current data with the previous subject. The signs were clear. Her body was succumbing to the procedure. A new test subject was brought in, an old man with a spine so hunched it was nearly circular. He looked frail, but it wasn't my job to question his suitability. As I suited up and prepared for the next procedure, I hoped I was growing immune to the dread that filled me each time. The old man, silent and seemingly resigned, was strapped to the chair. His arms were spread in a T shape, his legs fastened securely, and his head locked into a square-shaped device. His eyes were forced open, a block of solid green acid positioned just millimeters away. A large glass box enclosed his head. The procedure commenced. As I moved the block of acid to touch his eyes, his screams filled the room. I sealed the glass box, activated the heater, and watched as the acid burned his skin and eyes. The chamber resonated with his agonizing screams and the clatter of the device shaking with his futile struggles. An hour later, what remained was a gruesome mix of black, red, and green patches where a face used to be. I allowed myself to shut my eyes momentarily, seeking solace from the horrific sight. But the guilt of possibly executing an innocent person weighed heavily on me. "It ends here," I announced to my team, ending the procedure by activating a blade that cleanly decapitated the old man. Back at my desk, typing my report felt like a mundane task after the day's events. I planned to upload the video recordings as usual, but my laptop was missing. As the lights flickered and I heard strange noises, a sense of unease crept in, and I couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong. As I prepared to rise and investigate the sudden disturbances, the phone's shrill ring halted me. "Carter Winslow from room FG87, to whom am I speaking?" I questioned, retrieving the handset. "Hey, it's Lyndon, your superior. I need you to demonstrate your ongoing work on the report to our latest assassin recruit. Consider it a part of the GIA contract trial," he responded. However, I found myself disconnected from his words as a figure slowly came into view outside my cubicle window. A ghastly pale woman with blonde hair clutching her throat, staggering towards me. A surge of panic washed over me. My mind raced with unanswered questions. How had she escaped? How did she traverse unnoticed across the lengthy corridor? And what was I supposed to do now? Blood trickled down her face, staining her sterile prison uniform as she painted a horrifying smile. Only a thin sheet of glass stood between us, doing nothing to curb my rising fear. "Winslow? Are you there?" Lyndon's distant voice pulled me back to reality from the phone lying on the floor. "I've come to warn you," she rasped, her voice laden with ominous foreboding. She began to reveal details about my family that she had no means of knowing, heightening my fear. The fact that it was not just my personal laptop they had gained access to, but an GIA database filled with my personal information, only amplified my worry. Fear escalated into dread as the realization dawned on me. They knew more than they were supposed to. I hit the emergency switch, dashing out of my cubicle as security swarmed in to recontain the woman, trailing crimson behind her. Upon entering the containment chamber, the open cell doors gave away the identity of they. The two missing subjects, now bearing eerie grins, sent chills down my spine. A rapid exchange with the lead scientist, who was equally in shock, confirmed my fear. The security guard had been negligent, leading to this catastrophic situation. I retreated back to the safety of my cubicle, sealing all the locks behind me before extracting my personal phone. I dialed my brother's number, needing to alert him to the impending danger. His cold, unfamiliar voice sent shivers down my spine when he finally answered. A mysterious email followed the unnerving call, vague, with unknown attachments. I opened the first file, a poorly captured video that revealed a horrifying sight. My family, unconscious, and bound in what appeared to be a warehouse. They were in danger because of me. The alarm blaring in the background did nothing to drown out the chilling voice speaking in the video. Fear consumed me as I choked, the reality of the situation setting in. Would law enforcement be able to help? I couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation that the answer was no. The line between personal safety and duty was being violently blurred. As I cranked up the volume and rewound the video, a familiar, eerie voice echoed through the speakers. "Hello, Winslow." In the grainy footage, a man entered the frame, though I could only discern him from the waist down, clad in black jeans and sneakers. A second figure followed, clothed in a prison uniform and barefoot. The man in sneakers began to douse my parents and Max with water, gradually rousing them to consciousness. The sight of their terrified faces stirred an unbearable dread within me. The camera shifted focus, closing in on my father as the teenager tilted his chair, causing him to fall onto his back. The subsequent events unfolded in a horrifying blur. The gleam of knives, the stomach-churning realization of what was to transpire, and then the screams. My father's life was violently extinguished before my eyes, his body grotesquely mutilated. Overcome by horror and grief, I looked away, returning my gaze only to see the life drained from my father's face. The shock and anguish felt visceral, my nails digging into my palms until they bled. The second video, ominously labeled Woman 2, featured my mother. The unsteady footage revealed the same teenager restraining my mother, muffling her terrified cries. A red liquid, eerily glowing, was drawn into a syringe. I watched in numb disbelief as they injected her, triggering a grotesque reaction. The sight of her skin turning a sickly blue, the horrifically silent struggle for breath, and the blood. I slammed the video closed, my sobs echoing around the cubicle. As I reluctantly opened the next video, Man 3, I noticed a role reversal. The teenager was in the scene now, the focus on my tear-streaked brother Max. His tormentors poured the sinister red liquid onto Max's face, drowning out his cries with sadistic laughter. My stomach churned and I heaved, the sounds of his suffocation too much to bear. In the final video, the two murderers reveled in their cruelty, displaying a laptop that held damning evidence of my own actions. Their words pierced through me, revealing the horrifying mirror they'd created, mirroring the torture I had inflicted on their fellow prisoners onto my own family. Their laughter rang in my ears as the screen went black, their threats chilling me to the bone. I was left with the cold reality of my sins. I had brought this upon my family, had sent them to their deaths. I was their executioner. Their blood was on my hands. Karma had returned to haunt me, the consequences of my actions now a grotesque reality. A wave of self-loathing washed over me as I began to question the path I'd chosen. How had I allowed myself to become an instrument of pain and death, causing not only suffering to the victims, but immense grief to their families? How had I lowered myself to a position even criminals would scorn? The knock on my door went ignored as I lost myself in a spiral of guilt and regret. I relived every heinous act I committed in vivid detail. The bloody hand I had clutched, the poison I had injected, the faces I had burned. I'd ignored the humanity of these victims. I'd felt nothing. But now, consumed by guilt and remorse, I knew what I had to do. I unlocked my door and dashed past an unsuspecting man, heading towards the boss's office. My reckoning was about to begin. I descended to the lower level, my gaze scanning the room for the lethal instrument that would seal my fate, Lyndon's gun. Plucking it from its resting place on the top shelf, I ascended back up, my footsteps echoing through the deserted hallway. The chilling laughter and contemptuous jeers of the inmates, the furious curses of a flustered Lyndon, it all melded into a symphony of madness that sent shivers down my spine. Both staff and contracted executioners had swarmed around the detention chamber. their faces a tapestry of confusion and anger as they tried to comprehend the sudden turn of events. Muscling my way through the throng, I found myself at the entrance of the chamber that was still holding the blonde woman. As the door closed behind me, muffling the tumultuous noise outside, I could see her, her body still strapped to the wall, racked by spasms of pain and terror, her face a ghastly palette of deathly pallor. Advancing towards her, I leveled the gun at her forehead. "I believe you," I admitted, my voice choked with regret and sadness. "Truth or not, I believe you because you were right. I am a murderer." Her eyes widened as my confession hung in the air, and without another word, I pulled the trigger, ending her suffering in a merciful silence. I sank down onto the cold, sterile floor, a dam of pent-up guilt and grief breaking within me. I wept for the monstrous acts I'd committed, for the unspeakable disgrace I'd brought upon humanity, for the soulless monster I had become. If I were truly the feared Carter Winslow everyone believed me to be, I would be basking in my actions, devoid of remorse or guilt. But the tears streaming down my face told a different story. My tale of horror and regret ends here, not to be shared or spoken of again. Can I take pride in anything I have done in my life, save the final act I'm about to undertake? I have learned the hard way that my birth itself was a mistake, and the remedy to that error was now within my grasp. Knocking resounds from the door, urgent and insistent, but it falls on deaf ears as I aim the gun at myself. I hesitate, an unfamiliar sensation of fear crawling up my spine. It's a grim irony, really. The fear I now feel was no doubt shared by the victims I had so heartlessly slaughtered. They weren't afforded a choice, but I am. It's time to correct my existence, to erase the stain that is Carter Winslow from this world. As the echoes of my demise linger, a lady scientist strides confidently into the research hall, her face adorned with a triumphant grin. Her presence brings a hush to the room, all eyes turning to her in anticipation. "Guess who Linden's new head researcher is?" she announces, basking in the applause that follows. She saunters over to her new assistant, the little bald scientist, who congratulates her with a pat on the back. "You won't go crazy and shoot yourself like Winslow did, right?" he jests. The newly appointed head researcher reassures him with a professional flourish. They discuss the continuation of the experiments, her eagerness to begin palpable in the room. The chamber, now emptied of life, beckons her. As she steps in, a sense of elation fills her. This is where she will continue my gruesome work, and she can't wait to get started. She pauses, her mind drifting to my suicide, finding it perplexingly strange. To her, my prototypes and reports were nothing short of excellent, far superior to anything she had produced. I was the perfect fit for the role, and she couldn't fathom why I would want to end my life. Her inability to comprehend stems from her true nature, one that she was born with. She was unadulterated evil, and as such, she was incapable of understanding the profound guilt and regret that had driven me to my end. As the specter of my guilt fades, she takes her place in the vacant chair, her twisted anticipation for the horrors yet to come hanging heavily in the air.